By the time the storm rolled in, the town had already grown used to its silences, the kind that linger between people who have learned not to ask certain questions anymore. The wind howled over the Ozark hills, rattling porch swings and whispering through hollow trees, and the rain poured the way it always had on anniversaries that nobody wanted to acknowledge. Somewhere inside that storm, the church bell rang even though no one had touched it, and the dogs down the valley began to bark before the first pair of bare footsteps touched the pavement. They came out of the woods at dusk. 3 figures. Taller than memory. Thinner than they should have been. Movements slow, synchronized, as if they shared a single thought. Their hair hung wet against pale faces, their clothes were wrong like they belonged to another time, and their eyes looked like they had seen something no one in town could survive seeing. The first person to spot them was an old logger who had been alive long enough to recognize the shape of dread. He didn't shout. He didn't wave. He simply froze, because he knew those faces, and yet nothing about them felt familiar anymore. 8 years missing. 8 years of search teams and candlelight vigils and children taught not to speak their names aloud. 8 years of rumors eating at the town like termites beneath floorboards. And now, without warning, without sound, the triplets simply walked back as if the forest had grown tired of keeping them. They didn't cry. They didn't smile. They didn't even look relieved to see civilization again. They just stood there on the rain-slick street, water dripping from their fingertips, breathing in air that somehow seemed wrong to them. When the sheriff finally approached with his trembling flashlight, they turned their heads in perfect unison. "Did you find your way home?" he asked, voice cracking. And the girl, Mara, who used to laugh louder than anyone in town, blinked slowly before answering in a voice that sounded borrowed from a place where warmth could never reach. "We didn't get lost," she whispered. The street fell silent. "We were waiting, until it was ready to let us go." The day the triplets vanished was supposed to be ordinary, the kind that passes so quietly it barely leaves a trace. It was late autumn, the kind of season when the Ozark woods glow with dying color and the air carries the faint scent of wet bark and cooling earth. Silas, Mara, and Jonah were only 9, small enough to still be called children yet old enough to be trusted to walk the short stretch from school to home. Teachers remembered them leaving together like they always did, backpacks bouncing lightly, Mara laughing at something Jonah whispered, Silas walking slightly ahead like he always did, pretending he wasn't afraid of anything. That simple walk should have taken 10 minutes, but somewhere between familiarity and forest line, they drifted off the path and into a nightmare the town would never wake from. When their mother realized they were late, the fear came fast, illogical at first, then heavy with something that felt ancient, like an instinct that knew the woods could swallow more than footsteps. Their father searched first, then neighbors joined, then the entire town poured toward the trees with flashlights slicing through shadow. They found the torn page from Mara's notebook near the trail, rain-softened and smeared with ink as though it had tried to say something no one could read anymore. Shoe prints overlapped in mud, 3 small tracks leading inward, growing confused, then spreading apart, as if the children had begun to drift away from one another in fear. Dogs picked up the scent and lost it just as quickly, circling the same patch of earth as if the trail simply stopped there. No broken branches, no bodies, no signs of struggle, only a widening dread that settled into the bones of every searcher. Helicopters traced the mountains, volunteers combed ravines, and parents begged the trees to give their children back while the woods stood silent, patient, and untouched by guilt. As night fell, voices calling the children's names turned into prayers, then into angry accusations, then into stunned disbelief as reality refused to offer answers. In a place where the land usually explained itself through tracks, smells, and sounds, the absence of evidence felt like the loudest thing of all, and it was then the town realized whatever had taken the triplets had not simply hidden them, it had erased them from the world they once belonged to. The search began with hope, loud and determined, like a collective heartbeat refusing to slow, and for a while the town believed effort alone could wrestle the children back from whatever had taken them. Men who had hunted these hills since boyhood led the way, confident that nothing in the Ozark woods could hide for long without leaving a mark. They moved in organized lines at first, mapping the terrain, marking trees with strips of cloth, shouting the triplets' names until their throats burned. Women brought food and lanterns, teenagers carried ropes and blankets, and even the elderly stood at the edge of the forest with hands clasped, listening for any faint sound that might prove the children were still somewhere out there, waiting to be found. When daylight passed with no sign, the sheriff called in more help. Search dogs were brought in, their paws pressing patterns into the damp soil, noses low, tails tense, but they circled and circled as though the scent kept running into a wall that shouldn't have been there. Helicopters swept above the valleys, their lights combing through the dense canopy like shaking hands trying to peel back darkness. Volunteers fanned out until the woods were full of voices, flashlights, and the metallic clatter of equipment, yet somehow the forest swallowed all that human presence without reacting, as if it had closed itself to them. Hours turned into days, and hope began to feel heavier than courage. The search radius grew wider, desperation stretching it past logic. Reservoirs were dragged, abandoned cabins forced open, caves explored with trembling lights that barely pierced the suffocating black. Every new area searched and found empty did not bring relief, it deepened the terror, because emptiness meant the children were nowhere understandable. Rumors took root in the silence between official briefings. People spoke of old stories about the woods, things whispered only late at night, things everyone claimed not to believe until they were forced to consider what else could erase 3 children without a trace. Eventually, news vans left, outside volunteers drifted home, and the massive search shrank into tired, stubborn repetition. The town kept pushing back into the hills because stopping felt like admitting the truth no one dared say aloud, that whatever happened to the triplets could not be solved by footprints, flashlights, or human persistence, and the forest, vast and indifferent, seemed determined to keep its secret buried where no one could reach it. In the months after the search faded and the posters began to curl at the edges, the town discovered silence was not as empty as it pretended to be. It started with small, uneasy murmurs, hunters returning from the ridge swearing they saw flickers of light moving deep between the trees where no trails ran and no campsites existed. These weren't campfires or flashlight beams, they glowed wrong, pulsing slow like a heartbeat, disappearing the moment someone tried to get closer. Then came the sounds. People living near the tree line began waking in the middle of the night, unsure if what they heard was wind or something shaped like voices hiding inside the wind. Low, rhythmic sounds carried across the hills, not quite music, not quite chanting, something steady and patient that made people feel inexplicably ashamed for listening. By winter, the stories no one wanted to believe grew teeth. Drivers passing the edge of the forest late at night spoke of glimpsing movement in their headlights, 3 pale shapes standing between the trees, never running, never fully seen, just enough to make the heart slam and the brain second-guess itself. Children whispered to each other at school that the triplets weren't gone, they were practicing how to return. Old men who had sworn all their lives that superstition was foolish began locking their doors earlier, not out of fear of intruders but because the dark outside didn't feel like regular dark anymore. Strangers passing through town heard the rumors and laughed, but the laughter came out brittle because even they could sense something tight in the air, something unspoken that pressed down on everyone who stayed too long. Church attendance rose, not because people suddenly found faith but because they needed walls that felt blessed, something human to cling to when the woods groaned and shifted and seemed to lean closer to the town every night. The sheriff dismissed most of it publicly, calling it grief twisting people's senses, but even he stopped driving alone past the logging road where the footprints had vanished. What frightened everyone most was that none of these sightings led to answers, only to more questions, and with every whispered account the line between memory, myth, and reality thinned, as if the forest had begun answering back in a language no one truly wanted to understand. Grief did not arrive in their home all at once, it soaked in slowly like rain through rotten wood, weakening everything it touched until nothing sturdy remained. At first the parents clung to each other the way people do when the world collapses, believing that shared pain would bind them tighter, but sorrow is a heavy thing and they carried it differently. Their mother could not sit still, could not sleep, could not stop replaying that last ordinary morning, as if staring backward hard enough might undo reality. She left the porch light on every night, baked their favorite meals as if they might walk through the door hungry, and spoke to the empty rooms in a voice she struggled to keep gentle. Their father broke in quieter ways. He went rigid, spoke less, worked longer, then stopped working altogether, as if silence might somehow fix what shouting and searching could not. He stayed out late, drifting toward the tree line like a man standing on the edge of an ocean, knowing it could swallow him too. Arguments replaced shared tears. Every conversation turned into accusation without either of them meaning it to. Someone should have picked them up, someone should have noticed sooner, someone should have done something differently, and although neither said it aloud, both wondered if fate had chosen the wrong family simply because they had once dared to believe nothing bad could find them here. Their house, once noisy with laughter and footsteps, grew haunted in a way that had nothing to do with ghosts. The triplets' bedrooms remained untouched, little shrines of frozen innocence, toys gathering dust, clothes still folded in drawers like promises waiting to be kept. Friends stopped visiting as often, not because they didn't care but because grief that deep frightened people. It reminded them of how fragile their own lives were. Eventually the mother left for a while to stay with relatives, needing distance from the house that pulsed with memories. The father stayed until even he couldn't bear the echo of absence in every hallway. The porch light, once a stubborn beacon of hope, burned out and was never replaced. The yard grew wild, the mailbox rusted shut, and the house stood there like a mouth that had forgotten how to speak. The town learned to drive past without looking directly at it, because gazing too long at that empty place felt like staring directly into the wound everyone wished would finally close but never did. It happened on a night so loud with thunder that at first no one heard the church bell ring, yet it rang anyway, echoing through the valley like an alarm no human hand had set. Rain hammered rooftops and slid down the abandoned house where the triplets once lived, beating against windows of a town that had almost convinced itself the past was buried. Lightning stretched across the Ozark sky in crooked veins, splitting the dark open just long enough for people near the edge of the woods to notice movement where nothing should have been. 3 shapes stepped out from the tree line, slow and certain, as if they had merely been standing there waiting for the sky to give them permission. Bare feet pressed into the flooded road, hair plastered to faces aged far beyond their years, their bodies thin but upright, like something had preserved them rather than starved them. They didn't run toward safety, didn't cry for help, they simply walked with synchronized calm, their eyes fixed forward as if they were returning to a place they had rehearsed reaching for a very long time. The first person to see them thought they were strangers, maybe lost hikers or storm victims, but then recognition crashed through him so violently he gripped the porch railing to stay upright. Word spread faster than the rain. Doors opened, lights flicked on, and the town gathered in stunned clusters, unable to speak the names everyone's mind was already screaming. The sheriff arrived with shaking hands, unsure whether to approach them like children or like something he didn't have a protocol for. When flashlights finally framed their faces, what terrified everyone most wasn't just that they were alive, it was that they seemed impossibly calm, as if fear was a memory they no longer understood. They blinked without panic, their breathing steady, their expressions distant, carrying an unsettling absence of relief, like returning wasn't a victory but an assignment. Doctors rushed forward, blankets thrown over narrow shoulders, questions spilling into the storm, but the triplets only exchanged brief glances between themselves, tiny flickers of communication that didn't need words, and the town, soaked and shivering, felt the sickening realization that whatever had kept them alive out there had not released them gently, and whatever they had walked away from might not be done with them at all. At the hospital, relief quickly tangled with unease as the sterile lights revealed details the storm had hidden. Nurses whispered first, then doctors leaned in closer, brows knitting with disbelief as they examined each of the triplets. Physically, they should have been broken after 8 years in the wilderness, yet their organs were astonishingly healthy, their bodies somehow maintained like someone had carefully monitored them. But alongside that impossible wellness were marks no one could explain. Fine, deliberate scars traced symbols across their backs and ribs, not random injuries from accidents or survival, but patterns shaped with intention, as if a steady hand had carved meaning into their skin. Bruises existed in rings, not scattered, and faint burns appeared in matching places on each sibling, creating a mirrored map of ritualized harm. Their heart rates were calm, unsettlingly synchronized, as though they had practiced breathing together. Medical staff spoke softly, as if raising their voices might awaken something better left sleeping. Tests were run in frantic waves, blood drawn, scans taken, every machine searching for reason and failing to find one that sounded human. Old scars suggested repeated procedures, healed too neatly, like whoever touched them understood how to damage without destroying. The children didn't flinch under the needles or react to pain the way normal teenagers would. They watched the doctors with detached patience, like observers rather than patients, and when questioned, Their answers slid away from detail, wrapped in vague calmness that felt rehearsed. They didn't say who hurt them, didn't say where they had been, but occasionally one of them would glance toward the window, toward the dark line of trees in the distance, as if they were waiting to be summoned back. The sheriff demanded explanations, specialists were called in, files filled thicker by the hour, yet every piece of evidence only made the situation worse because all of it pointed toward something carefully controlled and utterly inhuman in its discipline. The room filled with the smell of antiseptic and the weight of dread as everyone realized survival hadn't been miraculous luck but the result of something watching them, tending to them, shaping them into whatever they had become, and the triplets lay there beneath hospital blankets like quiet vessels carrying a truth no one in that building was ready to hear. At first the town tried to wrap their return in celebration, forcing joy over the uneasiness everyone felt, throwing banners across streets and baking casseroles as if normal kindness could drown out what didn't feel right. People hugged them, though the embraces felt like touching cold glass. Reporters arrived, microphones thrust forward, the church opened its doors for prayer, and the school prepared to welcome them back, but beneath every smile rested a tremor of dread no one dared admit aloud. The triplets sat through it all with polite stillness, their eyes drifting as though human noise was something they remembered rather than belonged to. When they finally began to speak, relief flooded the town for a moment, until that relief twisted into something worse than silence. Their voices were steady, almost musical, each syllable precise and measured in ways that sounded practiced, like lines from a script they weren't allowed to change. They spoke in fragments about care and purpose instead of fear or survival. They described time not in days or years, but in cycles, in watching and listening, in waiting for instructions. They used plural phrases that didn't make sense, saying we were taught, we were kept right, and we never really left, as if whatever owned those woods had woven itself into their understanding of existence. People listened with growing sickness, noticing how their words echoed each other, as though one whispered thoughts the others simply completed. When asked who took them, the siblings did not name a person. They did not cry, accuse, or ask for justice. They spoke about presence, about something old and endless that held them still, and their tone never trembled. Even when conversations turned to painful topics, they did not show anger, grief, or gratitude. Their faces barely shifted, their smiles wrong when they appeared at all, too slow, too deliberate, like a gesture copied rather than felt. Late at night, nurses reported hearing them talking softly in unison from separate rooms, repeating words like prayers, then stopping at the exact same second. Families who tried to comfort them eventually left with forced cheerfulness and shaking hands, because being near them felt like standing in front of a calm ocean while knowing something enormous moved just beneath the surface, and every carefully formed sentence the triplets spoke sounded less like relief and more like a warning wrapped politely in borrowed human language. When they finally chose to explain what had happened, there was no drama in their voices, no trembling confession, only a dreadful calm that made the truth feel heavier than any scream could have. They didn't stumble over memories or struggle to describe trauma, they spoke with the strange clarity of people who had rehearsed their story for years while the world forgot them. They said they had not been lost, not for a moment. They had always known exactly where they were. The forest didn't confuse them, didn't starve them, didn't hunt them. Instead, it held them the way a hand might hold something fragile, not out of kindness, but because it served a purpose. They described being watched, not by a man or a group or anything with a human face, but by something vast, old, and patient, a presence that did not speak in words but in pressure, in silence, in the kind of awareness that made them feel as though the trees themselves had eyes. It didn't hurt them without reason. It didn't comfort them either. It simply kept them, like precious objects placed on a shelf until needed. They said time stopped meaning anything. There were no seasons, only cycles of attention, moments when the presence leaned closer and moments when it drifted back, though it never truly left. They learned to stay still, learned to listen, learned that resistance only brought a colder kind of attention, something that pressed inside their thoughts until obedience felt natural. When doctors asked what it wanted, the triplets exchanged that eerie glance again, a flicker of shared thought sliding between them. They spoke carefully, like children afraid of disappointing a teacher who wasn't in the room but was absolutely listening. It wanted order. It wanted watching. It wanted the town exactly as it was, unchanged, quiet, blind to the truth just beyond its borders. They said the presence didn't only live in the woods, it stretched like roots under everything, feeling every sound, every fear, every whispered prayer, and it chose them to understand that. They were not survivors returning home. They were messengers that had been shaped, disciplined, and prepared, and the more they spoke, the clearer it became that whatever had claimed them had never stopped owning them, and that coming back was not escape but continuation of something that had only just begun. After the triplets' revelation, the town could no longer ignore the weight of what they carried with them. At first, people tried to dismiss the warnings as childish exaggeration, the ramblings of traumatized children who had endured unspeakable hardships, but events soon made disbelief impossible. One by one, livestock disappeared from farms near the forest's edge, carcasses found days later mutilated in ways that no predator could account for, neatly carved symbols and marks eerily reminiscent of the ones etched into the triplets' own skin. Cattle, goats, and even family pets vanished, leaving behind only cryptic signs that chilled the residents into silence. Soon, human disappearances began in whispers. Teenagers walking home from friends' houses, hikers in the hills, a man who had once been part of the search effort 8 years prior, all gone without trace, leaving doors ajar and beds empty, as if the town itself had begun swallowing its own children in quiet compliance. At night, strange carvings appeared along tree trunks and fence posts, patterns sharp and precise, impossible to attribute to any person moving unseen through the dark without leaving more evidence. Locals recognized them immediately, because they mirrored the scars on Silas, Mara, and Jonah, symbols that now seemed less like personal markings and more like instructions, warnings, or maps meant for someone or something else. The air felt thicker, heavier, and every shadow in the woods seemed to twitch with expectation. Hunters spoke of footsteps trailing them for hours in places no human could follow, and dogs barked at nothing visible, growling at a presence only they could perceive. Sleep became impossible for many. People began leaving town quietly, unable to bear the invisible weight pressing from the trees, while those who stayed kept doors bolted, lights burning late into the night, and voices low enough not to draw attention. The triplets themselves remained eerily composed, speaking less and watching more, their eyes following things that could not be seen and noting behaviors that adults would dismiss if not for the tangible horrors appearing elsewhere. The town realized that their presence was not a return to safety but a signal that the balance had shifted, that the forest, or whatever claimed it, was extending beyond its boundaries, influencing life within its reach, testing obedience and fear. Every symbol, every vanished animal, every unexplainable disappearance reinforced a truth the town could no longer ignore. The woods were not passive, and the children had not merely survived them, they had become intermediaries for a force that had begun demanding the town's attention in ways impossible to evade. The final revelation came slowly, in the hushed hours when the town was too afraid to speak, and even the wind seemed to lean closer to listen. The triplets, who had returned with such unnatural calm, began to speak in ways that left parents and officials alike frozen with unease. They did not claim victory over the forest or insist they had escaped. Instead, they said they had been released, and that release carried its own purpose. Their words were precise, chosen with care, each one weighed as though it could summon consequences into being. The forest, or whatever had held them, was not content to simply claim or punish, it sought communication, compliance, and acknowledgement, and the triplets were its emissaries. Every scar on their bodies, every synchronized gesture, every fragment of speech was meant to serve as a warning, a demonstration that the boundaries between the town and the forest were thinner than anyone dared imagine. They described a cycle of observation and obedience, a slow teaching that stretched over years, shaping them into vessels for a message the town was only now beginning to hear. "We didn't escape," Mara whispered one evening, voice low and flat, "we were sent back. To prepare them. To remind them. It wants respect. It wants," her voice faltered, but Silas and Jonah finished the thought with identical, chilling clarity, attention. "It wants what belongs to it." Families understood immediately that this was more than metaphor or superstition. The disappearances, the mutilated animals, the carvings in the trees, they were not random acts. They were lessons, instructions, a pattern laid bare for everyone to recognize if they dared. Those who ignored the signs risked not only the wrath of the woods but becoming part of it. In town meetings that had been intended as celebrations of return, tension replaced jubilation. People questioned what compliance looked like, what actions might appease a force that could not be reasoned with, whose presence extended beyond the visible, its influence reaching into homes, fields, and the very minds of those who lived nearby. The triplets offered no easy guidance, only cryptic statements and the knowledge that they were living proof of the forest's reach. Their calm demeanor, the strange synchronicity of their speech and movement, and the echoes of rituals carved into their skin became a blueprint of terror. The town began to sense that their return was not a gift but a summons, and that unless its warnings were understood and followed, the cycles of disappearance, mutilation, and fear would only intensify, stretching beyond the forest's edge to remind everyone that nothing human could defy the will that had shaped the triplets and now demanded acknowledgement through them.